Now I would like to introduce our opening keynote speaker. And I'm proud, actually, to introduce Professor Dana Kaff as our opening keynote speaker. The 2018 edition of City Debate is inspired by the content of her edited book, Fast Forward Urbanism, Rethinking Architecture's Engagement with the City, which I regularly assign as a co-reading to my architecture and urban design students. And I would like to thank her again and again for accepting this invitation. Dr. Kaff is Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she is also the director of City Lab, an award-winning think tank that explores design innovations in the emerging metropolis. Since receiving her PhD in architecture from UC Berkeley, Dr. Kaff has published and lectured widely about urban design, spatial justice, the architectural profession, affordable housing, and embedded computing. She is author of several books, including The Provisional City, about housing in Los Angeles, Architecture, the Story of Practice, and Fast Forward Urbanism. She leads a major multi-year program at UCLA called the Urban Humanities Initiative, funded by the Mellon Foundation. The program focuses on design, urbanism, and humanist perspective in Pacific Rim megacities, and is the subject of a forthcoming book titled Urban Humanities with MIT Press in 2018. Most recently, Dr. Kaff accomplished what she considers as her greatest achievement. At the request of California Congressman Richard Bloom, she co-authored a bill that became law in 2017 to allow backyard homes or granny flats on all single-family properties, virtually doubling the density of the suburbs throughout the entire state. 10 years of research, as well as several design prototypes, led to this policy innovation, which has deep implications for housing affordability and impacts over 8 million residential properties. Her opening keynote is titled Architecture Without Planning, Shaping the Humanist City. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dana Kaff.
Is that working? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to the Dean and to Professor Saliba. This is my first visit to Beirut, and I'm both impressed and terrifically humbled by what I've seen in the last few days. Impressed with the intelligence of the students and the amazing vitality of the city, humbled by the scale of the problems that you deal with in studios here, of a nature that I hope that you can look at the work that I'm showing and see some connection. We'll try to make that connection in the discussion. But I think you have some profound problems and issues and solutions in front of you that I would be very happy to learn from you. As Professor Saliba says, I'm going to speak tonight about an idea that we could have an architecture without planning and actually shape the city. This question of architectural urbanism is one that I've been thinking about for 10 years, and I think maybe I would find a good home here at AUB, where you have an architecture program that leads to urban design and urban planning, which isn't a very logical structure from an American point of view, but one that I'm always advocating in my own work and in my own practices. All right, so I'm going to launch right in. What I want to show you is the way that architecture's interest in the city has evolved and what shape it might take and what shape we might attempt to guide it. So these are the kinds of architectural urbanisms that we often find in the international media. They're large-scale, conceptual, sort of blank form, master plan, massive interventions. At some level, it seems like they would never actually take shape, and yet places like John Jurdy's Canyon in Istanbul does take shape on something like 8 hectares with 10 million square meters of interiors access. Something that is beyond a building and beyond the scales of the city, not beyond the scale of the city, but certainly beyond the scale of a building. And we can hardly call this a project. Some of these, like Masdar, will roll out over 40 years, and after year 5, not follow any aspect of the plan except for in the loosest sense. So it's a little bit unclear how it is that we're thinking of ourselves as architects, also as urbanists. It's not just in practice that we see these kinds of attentions from architects to urban projects. In a series of exhibitions, we see architects presenting what the city should be for the public, whether it's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which actually ran a series of very interesting political exhibitions that architects controlled, not planners or urban designers, about the shape of the city, to the Venice Biennales, where Richard Burdett primarily exhibited issues of density, a kind of abstract notion of cities that allowed us to compare one to the other. And I find myself also culpable in this same project across the universities. Am I not projecting? That's all right? Yes? Someone wave their hands if it's not going well. Okay, thank you. It's good, I think. We also write books, we architects, and I consider myself an architect by training, though an urbanist by demeanor, about all forms of urbanism, ex-urbanism, we might say, whether it's ecological urbanism or infrastructural urbanism. And the book that Professor Saliba referred to, Fast Forward Urbanism, was the contribution that my colleague Roger Sherman and I made to this vast collection of architects attempting to find ways to address urban problems and urban projects. So with that as a setup, this is going to be the argument that I'm trying to move through in the evening tonight, that basically urbanism and urban design, Pache Ayubi, who's teaching urban design, are undisciplined in many ways. The urban object is one that we all seek to address. So at my university at UCLA, there are 100 different courses from across nearly as many departments who have the term urban in their description. Everyone thinks the urban object belongs to them. And in that sense, we don't have a way of disciplining, both in the sense of regulating, nor in the sense of having a historical and theoretical norm for organizing our thinking about the city. So within that, architects falsely presume, and we've done this since the modern era, that buildings and cities exist on a scalar continuum. This is the famous statement, from spoons to cities, we can design them all. It's just a singular continuum that goes from small to large. At the same time, planners, in their own conceptions of our relationship between architecture and the city, think that plans get populated by independent architectural objects. I'm going to show some examples of these different points. And in that sense, the urban, in some ways, foments or produces the political and disciplinary disruption, and that has led us to increasingly small-scale infill solutions in existing cities. I think that's one of the issues that Beirut really has struggled with, especially since the war, is the scale of urban intervention exceeds what we might think of as the kind of, I think what Hoyte calls surgical interventions that we might seek as we move forward in thinking about how to change cities. Because the scale of these interventions are always disruptive, we get into a political and collaborative context, often with extreme contestation. And that has meant that spatial justice has become a surface level discussion, where that's been always part of urban transformation. Now we talk about it openly. I hear that in the introduction from your dean. It's certainly part of the conversation of every urban transformation in Los Angeles today. And because of that, I'm especially interested, and I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight, but it's one of the projects I'm working on now, is how we bring the humanities and humanists into that conversation with us. We've spent a long time with sociologists and planners and people who use metrics. And now we also need, I think, to think about the humanities. And finally, I'm going to spend maybe a third of the talk telling you what I've been doing, because I think it's a kind of test of my theory, is to see what I've put into practice. Through City Lab, we've really been working on these very issues, and the particular construct that I want to explain is one that I'll call the radical increment. Okay, there's no test afterwards, but that is a sort of academic way of showing what I'm planning to talk to you about. So let's take that first step of kind of misconstrual of the relationship between architecture and urbanism, that architects falsely presume that buildings and cities exist on a scalar continuum. This is from Team 10. The Smithsons were following after Siam and showing how the house to the street to the district to the city is really just one single dimensional relationship, and that we could, as architects, just move up that, each one nested in the one prior. And we see that in some ways in the attempts that architects make to solve whole cities at once, whether you're plugging the housing unit into the infrastructure or laying out a kind of massing and zoning for how a whole city will function together. The second part of that misunderstanding or undisciplined way that we work together as architects and planners is that the master plans assume that any independent object can fit into the land use or zoning diagram and operate equally well. And so in Masdar, we get a neat and tidy master plan. It's really a modernist notion from the 30s and 40s. We haven't overcome our idea of a plan, although we have a lot of debate about that now, a plan that will work at the ground level that should extrude upward into a logical set of relationships. And those extrusions are what we architects think of as our work. But in a master plan, it's just any residential, any commercial project that might suffice. And so these kinds of pearls that you see on the side are interchangeable. They could be strung together in different ways. It doesn't matter where they sit as long as they're in the right zone. Pardon?
They kill the purpose.
Yes, they can. So I'm focusing a little bit on Masdar here, but even in a place like Masdar, where that planning was done by an architectural firm with a sense of how the architecture would work together, of course, the length of time that it takes to make a project, to effect a project, is so great, and the economics of it so vast and so outside of the sort of contextual world of how global economies operate, that it doesn't roll out, even though it's got a very heavy top-down financing and governance structure. So the first buildings seem very much in keeping with the Masdar plan, and very quickly it falls apart. So we might say that there are two extremes on this relationship between architecture and urbanism. In Barcelona, we might say we have urbanism without architecture. In other words, the urbanism, Cerdà's plan for the Eixample, is so strong that any architectural object can sit within it, and it contributes in a way that fulfills the function of the original idea. And we see, even though Cerdà's plan, which you are probably familiar with, wasn't exactly enacted as he intended, the city retains an absolutely firm hand on the urban ideal. And I think I put that map right over Richard Meyer's museum so that you didn't see the anomalous intervention in the middle of the urbanism without architecture. By contrast, we have Los Angeles, and I'm only learning whether Beirut follows Los Angeles rather than Paris. I'm not sure. But Los Angeles, I would say, has architecture without urbanism. Not only do we not have the master plan that I was showing you at Masdar, we have a kind of ever-rolling set of developers who have varying degrees of power and who enact different kinds of architectural projects, pretty large-scale urban projects, public projects, All of these are buildings that have been built in the last 20 years. They occur all along a single spine, which is the area that Los Angeles repeatedly wants to make its downtown. Gertrude Stein, when she said there's no there, was actually referring to another city in California, but it's almost always applied to Los Angeles because it's very hard to find the there. There is a downtown, a historic downtown, but it's never considered the proper downtown, which is always trying to find itself along Grand Avenue. And yet these buildings pay no attention to one another. They actually don't add up to something greater. They each just live along a relatively neutral spine. So if Barcelona is urbanism without architecture, Los Angeles is architecture without urbanism. And of course, what I would like to be arguing for is something that both participate. So I think that that's more likely today than it has ever been before. And the reason I think we can bring architecture as urbanism or architectural urbanism into play is because we're confronting infill conditions only now in most major cities. There are very few large-scale sites left, except pieces of 19th century infrastructure for the most part, or places that have been demolished for one reason or another. But here you're just looking at two parts of New York, and you can see this is new housing. Across the United States in major cities is an extreme housing crisis, not enough supply, and certainly not enough low affordable housing. And so every city is facing in its own way how to get more housing. And in this particular case, it's particularly telling that in a housing site, this is social housing that would have been built in the 40s, they're finding another tiny site where it's a potential development site. And that tiny sliver has become the new site of infill development. And this is a separate project, another social housing project in New York, where there was more open space than density, and now they're trying to infill that. It's a project that we're working on at City Lab as well. And so this kind of surgical response, or a sort of extreme infill, is the project of cities today. Because these projects occur in existing sites, they become political. There's a new kind of process that has to be engaged, which is a collaborative one, not just a participatory one, in which communities of interest and communities with a political voice are acknowledged and brought into the process. These furious residents don't look that furious in the photograph, but they can put up a long enough protest to make any kind of development slow down or stop, which has been the reason why they've been brought in more as collaborators than ever before. This idea, though, of bringing, of both doing kinds of infill projects, though very large scale in this case, and bringing architects and planners together to do that is not new. Of course, there are historical legacies that lead to that, and this is one that I've spent some time studying in Los Angeles, where the architect Richard Neutra and the planner Robert Alexander worked together on something like 280 acres or 140 hectares, more or less, right next to downtown, already inhabited by a low-income community, Hispanic community, to redevelop as social housing. This was what Richard Neutra called his closest attempt to make Rush City Reformed, the utopian scheme that he worked on during various parts of his life. And the idea was to build that entire area that you saw in the aerial photograph into a development with something like 3,300 units of housing. This then sparked a political entanglement that led to basically the fall of public housing across the United States. The mayor of Los Angeles was evicted out of office. Richard Neutra, in his letters to the Housing Authority, claimed that his nervous system was ruined, as was his bank account. It not only didn't happen, but they evacuated the entire site forcibly, creating an entire movement, really, of resident activists against large-scale development in Los Angeles. These were Mexican-American residents who owned their own property and who were forcibly removed when, even though they weren't going to build the housing, they cleared the site and ended up putting a baseball stadium on that site. And the reaction to public housing in general was then extreme. So that question of spatial justice that arises, historically, certainly we see it at various points in the history of cities, but it's actually very clearly evident in the post-war period in the United States condition when city growth in places like Los Angeles went through a new boom. That trajectory we see today again, not only in, say, the Occupy movements, which are taking public space, according to Richard Sennett, and redefining the role of public space in the city today, but also through various kinds of movements from, whether it's Arab Spring or the women's movements in the United States and across the world. If spatial justice, then, is one of the goals that we must make explicit in urban transformation and in architectural urbanism, then this is where I would suggest the lever to bring in humanists or those who are studying and professionals in the humanities comes into play, whether that's from history or cultural studies or literature. And this is an experiment we're working on now at UCLA. Maybe where we see humanists most clearly engaged in the transformation of the cities is when the visual anthropologists or journalist photographers went into those neighborhoods that no one else saw the insides of to show, in the case of Jacob Riis in 1890, literally how the other half lives. These were the immigrant tenements that were all over certain parts of New York. And Jacob Riis became the advocate for reformulating tenement policy, primarily through the vehicle of photography, which I would say in this case was a form of anthropology, a form of humanities. And so it was through these kind of images that a health collective, a health coalition, and a social coalition, and an urban planning coalition formulated to change the way the city built itself in the tenement or poor neighborhoods. But we might say that that ranged in two extremes. And maybe again here we see architecture and urban planning not as well conjoined as the opportunity seemed to present. And so Hugh Ferris, who was an architectural delineator and an architect, created a zoning law, the first comprehensive zoning law that existed in the United States, which was really a three-dimensional zoning law that allowed light and air into the city streets when skyscrapers were first being built at the turn of the century. This is in 1916. So it was more than just a land use plan in their conception, but it became codified in our traditional zoning formats. So the documentation and representation that persists from the 1916 zoning law is really one that laid out this separation of interests from sort of organization of spaces and infrastructure on the ground plane in contrast to the organization of the extrusion and the architecture that would be infilled into that ground plan. So this question of how it is our cities were going to deal with the social and human problems really condensed in the first formulation of an urban design program in the United States when José Luis Sert wrote the book, Can Our Cities Survive?, and started the program, the first program of urban design at Harvard. But I think we see in this book cover something about what the limiting view of urbanism might be at this stage in the nearly at the end of the Second World War. And that is the notion that people were a kind of demographic problem, that they exist in a tight, their problem is that they're living too closely to one another, and they're treated as a mass. And so this idea that we had a homogeneous population, too densely packed, and the package was part of the problem, seemed to characterize, and all of that sits on the modernist plan of efficiency and speed, right? So you see the freeway underlying the sardine can filled with people. And that short parable, I think, led us into an era when really sociological metrics seemed to govern our ideas about how cities might become more humane. Affordability became an economic problem without a notion of the narrative of the individuals, not even as much as we might say we could see in the photographs of Jacob Riis, who were telling real stories of real households and how those households lived in their daily lives. Whoops. Well, it's not then by chance that with that formulation of the problem of the city, that even when humanists, historians, and literature professors were involved then in trying to think through the problems of the city, that they did so with an idea of actually fitting in neatly with the social sciences. A round of area studies then became part of all humanist departments. We got Asian studies and Latin American studies and American studies as a kind of new geography. We might now talk about urban studies within the humanities, but the first round of that was large territories, national and continental kinds of studies that were brought as a geographic or spatial turn to the humanities. And this was in fact funded in the United States by various kinds of organizations like Ford Foundation, which actually worked for the government and was part of a intelligence collecting procedure of the, a kind of sub-military project. It was part of the Cold War efforts to manage the politics of these different areas, and the humanists were brought in to help do that, to read Russian and Russian literature and to try to understand what was actually going on in those places. I only show this to say that the history of trying to bring in humanities into our thinking about cities isn't new and isn't fraught. It is fraught. And there are many ways in which the humanities themselves have been misused and have allowed themselves to be misused in the project of the city. There's a new kind of resurgence within the humanities, in part because of the crisis in the humanities that's widely acknowledged, meaning basically that we're producing more literature PhDs than there are ever going to be jobs for them, for example. And so new competencies and new projects are being inserted into the humanities, and these are just some of them. It's sort of the ex-humanities project, environmental humanities, public humanities, medical humanities. All of these are shaping up, and again, I'm in the thick of this because we're formulating something called urban humanities that Professor Saliba referred to early on. We've been working for the last 6 years to try to bring humanists, architects, and planners together to work in a studio-like context, thinking about the history, the contemporary circumstance, and the future of Pacific Rim megacities. And so this is a whole direction of work that I'm doing now that I'm only going to at this point, and I'm going to shift to think about what we're working on in City Lab, which is really a much more architecturally focused attempt, and one that's been developing for much longer than the Urban Humanities Project. But if I came back in 5 years, I think I would be talking about this. So I'm hoping that that argument was part of what, I appreciate people nodding in that you've heard that part of the argument. And now I'm at this last piece, which is that by rethinking the relationship between architectural and urban projects, we can open new practices. And at City Lab, that new practice is really focused on the radical increment, or what I'll call the radical increment. And I would say that's what I'm calling architecture without planning. So let me tell you a little bit about City Lab and how it's organized. And then I'm going to walk through a few projects. So this is the installation that we were invited to put up at the Venice Biennale in 2010, and we began City Lab. I started City Lab in 2006 with these 5 initiatives, basically governing the projects that we take on. City Lab is a research and design center that generates all its own projects. So it's not a community design center where we have people who come to us who seek our research or services, though that's a very important kind of practice. Instead, we generate projects that we think will lead architecture and urbanism into new directions, and where there's kind of low-hanging fruit, we're thinking through the way we could bring architecture and urbanism together to help make models for the emerging metropolis. We're focused in Los Angeles, but we've worked in many other areas. This is just a timeline, though it's impossible to read. It gives you a kind of a sense of, over the years, the kinds of projects that we've taken on, the different striations or those different initiatives. And I'm going to just talk about 4 of them, or what I consider to be 4. Backyard homes, one called Chia Mesa, high-speed rail, and Westwood Village Vision. And the one that has the link is the longest running project in the lab. In fact, it started before the lab started, which is this Backyard Homes project. In doing so, I'm going to try and focus on this construct of the radical increment, which is defined by these qualities: that it's always an infill strategy, that it's a prototype, in other words, a kind of demonstration of what might happen next. It's never a singular project, the way we think of architectural projects being a solution to a problem. It's not that. It's a kind of solution that represents many solutions, that operates like a demonstration to other parts of the city, other architects, and to other planners. It's catalytic insofar as when it is implemented, it generates further repercussions in and around it. It's contingent, meaning there's no singular solution. I can't do a demonstration that would apply to every city over time, but in fact it's contingent on a lot of different conditions that have to be taken into account as the increment is planned. And the last thing is that it's dynamic, meaning it's not a static imposition, but one that is in fact by design intended to change. These radical increments can range from something very small, like a secondary unit on a suburban site, like the one above, to the creation of new urbanism around stations in the high-speed rail, which is a massive infrastructure project that may or may not finally happen in California. Pieces of it are being built now. So let me just take one such project to kind of walk through what a radical increment as a piece of architectural urbanism might be, or architecture without planning. This was a design competition for mini malls, basically something like a gas station size site that were all abandoned in Phoenix, Arizona, a desert, an extreme desert climate. And we won for this project that turns those mini malls into a kind of urban oasis. And that urban oasis would generate greenhouse products by having a kind of new skin that sits over the top of the mini mall. That would then be also paid for by the continuing advertisement that exists on the skin, which you see in the upper right. And that would also brand the city of Phoenix with this kind of green infrastructure that would exist throughout the city wherever a mini mall died, a new kind of Chia Mesa. Did you have chia pets here? That Basically, you put water on little seeds and they grew. That was the idea. That was the illusion. So you see in this City Labs initiatives, the sort of rethinking of green space, a post-suburban city, and at the same time, the idea that this wasn't a particular solution, but a solution that would operate in a prototypical condition in a city like Phoenix. Okay. So let me move on to something that's at the other extreme, which is this condition of the high-speed rail. California in general, Los Angeles in particular, like Beirut, is lacking in public transit and infrastructure in many ways. And there's an initiative to build a high-speed train that would link Los Angeles to San Francisco, as well as some places in between, so that you could go there in 2.5 hours, which is by a car something like a 6-hour drive. It's also linking suburbs to a city. For the most part, where the high-speed rail would stop is not very dense urbanism. The densest urban site would be San Francisco. Everywhere else, it feels as if a high-speed train is landing in the middle of a suburban wasteland. The people in Los Angeles would probably say I was exaggerating, but probably not. Anaheim is just such a suburban context, if I take wasteland out of my language, and yet it's going to be the busiest station along this new infrastructure, and that area in red is the area that's been designated for the new high-speed rail station. And these are the kinds of images we get. So here would be a conventional architecture and planning solution to a high-speed rail station. You have a kind of generic but gigantic mall, strange train shed, and a kind of urban plan of land use that's a kind of investment project. So that, I would say, would be the conventional approach from an old school planning and architecture perspective, not from an architectural urbanism approach, but from an architecture approach and a planning approach. There's a standard architectural project with a relatively generic solution, a land use plan, and they've cleaned the site. All right, that may seem, I think, often the default option when we're talking about making massive plans, but the idea of a radical increment is embodied in this much more complex project that I'd like to walk through with you, and I'll show you the end result of it. But of course, you see from in a radical increment, if a radical increment is also dynamic, no matter where I suggest it's headed, it may not be represented by the final rendering I propose, even though the final rendering is absolutely essential for people to have an understanding of where we might be headed. And that feels paradoxical, given our conventional ways of thinking about architecture and planning. So this project recognized that the high-speed rail was actually not going to build any parking. And since it's arriving in a suburban context, everyone would arrive by car. That then became the opportunity, or what we would call the low-hanging fruit, for this radical increment, which would be a staged and evolving parking solution, maybe the most boring part of any kind of station design. What we said was originally, as you could see from this photograph, it seems to be only parking in Anaheim at the moment. And so all the city needed to do was to designate a spine along parking lots that would then become the beginning of a new urban corridor, and that those parking lots would be the ones where you would have street vendors be given licenses or small-scale interventions at the very earliest phases, so that parking lots along that would be more attractive than the others in the yellow plan that you see at the top. As more transit users started to come to the Arctic station, parking in that whole area would become more valuable, so surface parking would be a less likely use, and structured parking would be likely to follow. And if that structured parking then still followed the spine, we would actually create, in the suburban city of space, as Albert Pope would call it, a small slice of cosmopolitan life that would really be organized by where parking garages fed out onto a single walking street. And no one walks anywhere in Anaheim, so this would become, I'm sure, an attraction. And the images that we worked on at City Lab with my partner Roger Sherman tried to lay out how that might look, because we don't think of parking lots as creating urbanity. It seemed like the perfect anachronistic blend in a place like Anaheim. So both of those examples, from the little mini mall turned into an oasis to parking garages turned into a cosmopolitan pedestrian zone, are forms of radical increments. And now to take a slightly different one, which is in a district of Los Angeles called Westwood. This is actually the neighboring district to UCLA, would be just the neighborhood right outside AUB's campus, which has been depressed for the last 40 years. And in this particular case, we spent 2 or 3 years studying the site and all of the constituents there, and maybe came up with something I would consider the most humanistic study of our research, saving the last one that I'll show you next. But in this particular case, we really looked at the history of Westwood Village and the narratives that people told themselves about the place, which were extremely well articulated and all fundamentally imaginary. The business people would say there's not enough parking, and the neighbors would say someone was shot there 20 years ago and it'll never be the same again. And the planners said, you know, there's just too many homeless people in that neighborhood. There's never going to be a way to turn that into a city. So all of these conflicting stories, fictions basically, were part of what we took into account, represented back to the community to think through how it was we might reimagine an entire district in this particular neighborhood. And as part of that reconstructing an imaginary or reconstructing a fiction, we developed 2 different schemes. And I think it was very important to develop 2 rather than 1, because we weren't trying to impose a solution, but to create a new discussion. And so these were very radical schemes for Los Angeles. The top one took all the cars out of Westwood Village. It would be like removing the cars from Hamra. And, you know, there would be no way to think about how that would function, because we depend upon them, even though it doesn't function as it is. And this was the problem in Westwood Village as well, not maybe traffic density, but all of the problems that cars produced there. So we turned the entire thing into a car-free zone. And the second one was to turn it into a cultural center where there would be new theaters, and parts of the university would move off the campus into the city to create a kind of cultural zone for Westwood Village that would become a new economic and metropolitan attractor. Those 2 kinds of end visions then became the sort of dialectic within which new ideas about Westwood Village, new fictions might be construed. And we held a number of public meetings about that, of course, with no resolution. But what we did do was to then generate a project that would make people feel like Westwood Village was worth investing in, both in terms of their imaginations as well as their finances, through a series of temporary events. And we called this project Westwood Village Blows Up, because it was a series of inflatable pieces that were put together by teams of people who lived and worked around the area in 3 different versions over 3 different weekends. This one was the Westwood Village living room, and it made a kind of play space out of all of these pieces. You see on the left a kind of digital and social model for how these would be assembled. In the second version, you took those same pieces and formed a kind of performance stage. And in the final version, that whole performance stage was lifted like an obelisk as a spectacle in and of itself that would be visible at night. And you see that in the rendering, Westwood Village having been originally planned as a series of towers that stood out from regional transit systems, regional arterials. Sadly, that project didn't get built. So I want to give you the last example, which is the one that Robert referred to as what I think of as the best achievement out of City Lab thus far, and how that began and how that ended. Because it seems to me one way we could think of architectural urbanism is as moving from and moving back and forth between architecture and planning, where both architecture and planning in our conventional senses are woven together for new results. So the very first project that we did at City Lab was one in which we tried to find ways to shift policy to produce market-driven affordable housing, not publicly subsidized social housing, but social housing that developers would build. And a series of teams of architects, young urban planners, and young developers, none of whom had been out of school more than 3 or 4 years, so people who already weren't burdened by the weight of the bureaucracies and exigencies of their disciplines, came together to work on teams to come up with a single policy change that would unleash new affordable housing. And I've been working on a series of those ideas that came out of that first set of competitions ever since, not just the Backyard Homes project, but several others. And the idea there was that no neighborhood really wanted large-scale housing imposed on their neighborhood. They really wanted small, broken-up projects. They didn't mind having new housing, but they wanted it to be scattered throughout their neighborhoods. And from a developer and a planner's and an architect's point of view, that was fine, but it took the same amount of bureaucratic energy to build 5 units as to build 50 units. And so the pressure was always to build bigger. Planners didn't want to deal with 100 little sites of 5 units each. They would much rather have a big site with 500 units. Architects couldn't make a profit on it, and neighbors, were going to resist if there was something large coming into their neighborhood. So the idea was to get a yes in my backyard rather than no in my backyard response from the neighbors and somehow create the same level of production of housing. So this might have seemed straightforward, and maybe at the beginning I thought I was working with something much simpler. I suspect I'll still be working on this project even though we've reached a kind of conclusion 10 years from now. But we decided we would look at what a backyard looked like. So Los Angeles fits the stereotype that most of you probably hold, which is as a sea of suburbs, or 80 neighborhoods in search of a city. These are all cliches that have in fact a level of truth about them. And I'm just showing you one example here. All of the yellow in that planning diagram is residential. There's 500,000 residential sites in Los Angeles. It's the largest number of parcels and the largest area of parcels in the city. And this is just one kind of neighborhood, I'd say not typical. We started where we thought it would be easiest and where we already saw many of these secondary units already being built illegally. So you see there, let me see if I can find a cursor, yes? So here's the one that's in the picture below, this one with a single house in the front and nothing in the back. But some of these have, maybe that's a garage, but these are probably 2 units and that's the original house. So something like in this particular neighborhood where the lots are, say, 50 feet by 350 feet, 17 meters by, 70 meters? Really long, deep lots. There were people illegally adding units all the way back. As an income strategy and as a family strategy. This also was a Mexican-American neighborhood and families tended to stay together, so different generations lived on the same property. People built them themselves outside of the building permitting process. Very deep, extremely deep. This is what I would call the extra long lots. So we actually did, I think, the first lot typology of properties that I've seen actually done in any city. Meaning, rather than looking at building types, we actually looked at property division types and thinking about the ways different lot divisions operated for new kinds of densities. And we discovered that there were 3 types of lots that would be very good for adding density. The extra large lot would be the first one. That seems obvious. A corner lot, the second one, because everything is driven by parking. And so if you didn't have to take a driveway to the back, but you could put a parking garage on the side street and build above it, that made it much more buildable. You could build on any size lot if it was on a corner. And the last one was an alley lot. And in Los Angeles, there are 800 miles of alleys, many of which then also had car access at the rear. So one of the problems you can see in these, so this is research project after research project that I'm telling you about. One of them was also, how would these different lot types produce different building types? And so we studied each lot type to think about the architectural type that would work there. So a corner lot, for instance, might be something that was politically more acceptable to add density if it gave back a little something to the neighborhood, whether that was a nursery for selling plants, or a childcare center, or a bench and a tree with a reading nook, that maybe there were ways in which you could in fact remake and improve the public landscape at the same time that you were adding density and changing the household economy. We also then looked at alley lots, which you see in the lower diagram, because alleys tended to be areas where there was mostly garbage and broken down streets, and a secondary set of units would create them to be more safer, greener, and much more habitable. And then this next idea was to think about how these would grow in a neighborhood over time. So you first would try, our own strategy for thinking about this was to build a demonstration project. You'd build it on these kinds of lots, corner lots, extra large lots, and alley lots, and you'd try your best to follow existing neighborhood patterns and to build them in a way that they didn't add much visibly to change the character of the neighborhood. And you could see then that potentially the neighborhood could control the levels of density that would occur. In fact, there was another city in California, San Diego, which had set a limit of 20% of all lots in any neighborhood could add a secondary unit. The neighbors thought that was good and passed a law about it locally, and no neighbor had ever even reached the 20% level, at least within the first 5 years of that law. So the fears that people had, which were extreme, that it would change parking, that there'd be strangers living in our backyards, that it would make it all dense, that it would take away all the trees, were more part of the fiction than the reality. So part of our project was to try to understand what the real concerns of the neighbors were as we were trying to think through how we could pass laws to allow the single-family zone to be twice as dense as it has been. Again, that's pretty low density by most urban standards. And in Los Angeles, the protest against that was that we were going to Manhattanize the city, which should, it was pretty ironic in a lot of ways. But in fact, those are real concerns that people have seen over the years, that their cities have not gotten better with new changes. They feel, for the most part, the cities have gotten worse. And that part is rational. And so how we collaborate with these community organizations in order to produce change is really one of the projects that architectural urbanism has to face. So we spent a lot of time working with neighborhood groups. We studied existing neighborhood patterns to see how it had been done informally and illegally before we started preparing and proposing architectural solutions that you see here. Like, could we in fact, in many lots, the majority of lots that are not corner lots or alley lots have only a 1.5 meter wide space between the house and the yard. So you had to have some kind of building structure that could collapse, could expand, that could actually work for various types of programmatic interests, because it turned out that no two backyards were the same. Even though you might think you could apply a standard solution, it was absolutely like a thumbprint. Each household had a different condition. So we generated a series of flexible models. We were working at the time with the city council and working through local means, which all of this would lead you to think that's where our change would happen. At the local level, we've done local studies, we've worked with the local communities, and yet there was always one or two very loud voices, not representative of the larger population, generally not people who needed affordable housing, but people who were trying to retain property value in some kind of abstract sense, who worked against any local ordinance. And that was a big insight to me, that in fact, this kind of consensus planning was absolutely not democratic. That as soon as we took it to a local city council, there would be one loud voice that was not representative, but forceful enough to stop the project that might be of benefit to the other % of the people. And we found an opening in the state government where we then, I wrote the bill with one of my colleagues who's a kind of policy wonk, and the two of us together wrote a policy that would allow second units throughout the entire single-family zone. We coordinated with a group of people in Northern California where they'd been studying some of their lot conditions and city conditions and put the two bills together, and it was miraculously signed into law, and it has all the qualities that I would say a radical increment exhibits. The housing implications of this, for the 9 years before we wrote the policy, the critique of City Lab's project was that I was approaching something so small to deal with something so large. And I feel vindicated when I look at the numbers in California now. In our city alone, there's a potential for 400,000 new units of housing to be built. In the county, just the province around Los Angeles, 1.5 million, and in the state, 8.1 million. And in every city across the state now, there are new practices coming up in architecture where they're producing housing in new ways. There are new kinds of service delivery models. Small contractors are getting jobs. And now cities are trying very hard to customize the state law so that they will be able to adapt it to their own conditions. There are only a few things that they cannot change. One is that those are allowed by right. Two, that they cannot require new parking if they're near transit. And three, that those have to be for rent, that they can't be sold. And those three things, I think, are the best we've been able to do thus far to ensure a series of new small building types that architects, housing activists, contractors, and renters are going to find useful. We then at City Lab wrote a book about how to do it, because working in any kind of planning context is not straightforward. So again, we're approaching this from many, many different directions. Let me see if I can just... and then we built one, which we built a little before we wrote the policy, but I wanted to show you this last. This is the last image. We built a test model that this one actually cost something like $12,000, but it doesn't have all of the infrastructure that any house would need. But it was built by unskilled labor, that is my students, and my son, actually. And in the end, was a kind of demonstration model that had that kind of fictional imaginary that propelled the whole project into some other dimension. In other words, it went beyond a kind of policy level to be inspiring. This little house, which sits on exactly the same square footage as a two-car garage, in other words, making the polemical case that we should be housing people better than cars, won a National American Institute of Architects Award, and we just won, I learned 3 or 4 days ago, an award for a world-changing idea, which is so ironic that it's this tiny house that resulted from 10 years of work. It's very satisfying. So let me just end by summarizing that this backyard home story is really the story of a radical increment, and that's the story of architectural urbanism. Maybe architecture without or even against, in some cases, conventional planning, I would like to suggest, is a form of urbanism. It grows from working within the existing dynamics of the city, planting the seeds of evolving ecologies rather than creating independent architectural objects or abstractly organized master plans. It acknowledges its cultural roots and political implications, thereby incorporating a humanist perspective that goes beyond but works with data, metrics, and the social sciences. So I could ask you, is this architecture? Is this urban design? Is this planning? It might be a bit of all of the above, and as a result, a new kind of practice, a kind of architecture as urbanism. Thank you. It's kind of hard to shut this off while the vacuum forming is going on. Should I? Okay.
Okay, before opening the floor for questions, I would like to make some commentary about some reflections about Professor Kaff's very inspiring presentation. Actually, I'm really amazed by the diversity of projects that City Lab has dealt with, from housing to parking sites to malls, and all this is revolving around the same idea of architecture as urbanism. But I will make my remarks will be more about the underlying substance rather than about the details, because I think that the details are really very interesting, and I will leave it open to the audience to ask more precise questions about the projects themselves. What is of particular interest to me is that how you critically reappraised mainstream and emerging trends in architecture and urbanism, like ad hoc incrementalism, catalytic interventions, participative strategies or planning. All what you mentioned today are mainstream ideas at this particular point. But what's really fascinating, what I found really interesting, that you reappraised these ideas and gave them another dimension, and also another terms of applicability. You see, I see that for you they are not definitive and radical solutions. They are more fluid concepts. There is the fluidity in your approach. Fluid concepts to be scrutinized and subjected to the complex realities of the city. You take the city as it is, and you just rethink these concepts in relation to existing dynamics and concepts. So also you tie them to the politics of design, and that's what really is interesting. We are not talking anymore about planning, but we are talking about the politics of design, of the practice itself. As for instance, when you ended up with the articulation of a new law. So I read your position, okay, although your basic concern is embedded in humanities principles. All of us, always architects, have dreamt to be social reformers, you know, it's not new. So, but what's interesting, I read your position that neither left nor right. I read it more as intermediary and open, meaning that it's informed by a sharp consciousness of the city as it is, as it can be, but not necessarily as it should be. And as such, you avoid the dual trap here. There is a dual trap of either staging utopian plans or preaching social activism. Okay, because these are the two extreme plans usually that, you know, radical planning and design fall in. So either utopianism on one hand or activism on the other. And you don't fall in these two traps, which is really, I think, was the most important inspiration for me in your presentation. Your brand of the right to the city or social justice is less about contestation or resistance, the European approach. It's more about a pragmatic idealism channeled through convincing design solutions, like we saw at the end in you know, your approach to densification, convincing design solutions that respond both to the public and private imperatives. So in my view, that's what really defines an informed and strategic approach to radical design. Okay, it's not about activism, it's about approaching transformation from within. Okay, from within the design practice itself. So this is clearly illustrated in City Lab, your think tank, how it bridges the gap between academic speculation, community needs, and client specification. And I think this is what really explains how you were able to translate design research inspired by vernacular community practices, like in the last example, into overarching state policies. This is really impressive, meaning that starting from an empirical research and ending up with law, with policies. So I would like just to open the floor with some speculations. And I have a question that I want to ask you at the end. I changed my mind, okay? So just I will end with some speculations. While your presentation takes Los Angeles as a field for design exploration and interventions, how far such recommended strategies as radical incrementalism may be considered as generic solutions applicable to Western and non-Western contexts, horizontal and vertical densification, processes, to compact and loose urban fabrics. And here I'm referring to Los Angeles, okay, in brief to Los Angeles and Beirut, okay, two extreme urban forms shaped by the same dynamics of real estate speculation and car-oriented mobility, because the two cities have these profound similarities, but they are opposite in terms of urban form. So also I'm wondering how small scale in vivo increments, you did not mention, but I read, you know, I know the literature by heart. So the in vivo meaning that it starts from a empirical investigation on site, okay? How small scale in vivo increments might constitute an effective tool for addressing post-war deserted sites, large-scale post-war deserted site, what Adrian Lahoud, our closing keynote speaker, refers to as post-traumatic urbanism. So now I arrive to the question that I'm hesitating to ask you. Okay, I will. Okay, torture. So. In view of your agenda for a humanist city, how would you envision the intersection between market-led and social-led design practices? market-led and social-led design practices? And would you consider collaborating with a corporate client?
Is microphone working again? You keep yours because I have a feeling you're going to have a retort. Well, yes, I'd work with a corporate client, of course. You're exactly right that I am an advocate of what can be. Absolutely. We've seen the trajectory of utopian schemes head straight to fascism, and that's for reasons that I think we could articulate pretty clearly. And resistance schemes generally don't have objects, right? If the sort of extreme versions of each doesn't leave me with the material culture that I think is one of the most important aspects of the city. It's certainly my aspect of the city, and that's the architectural component. So resistance doesn't get me anywhere, it just gets me what not to do. Not that resistance isn't an important part of what can be possible, but it doesn't lead to a model of architectural urbanism that gives us any traction. So yes, and in that vein, you must be willing to, like a zealot of sorts, work with anyone to convert them to making better cities, or to making a better city than where you are today. So yes, I mean, look, you have a version of that here, Solidaire, that I don't, say it again? Solidaire, that is a scale and an operation, an effect, instrumentally urban city making that I am unfamiliar with. I'm very interested in it, but it's so much more consolidated than the development community, which is more fractured in Los Angeles and in most other cities. So I don't know what that's like, but there certainly is no inherent reason why they too shouldn't be operative in making the city at different scales. To me, the key would be not to operate in a kind of tabula rasa condition, which is what development interests tend to want to do. They want more control, not less. They want larger sites, not smaller. I mean, there's a kind of logic to the development industry that works against the ideas of something like a radical increment, meaning, or what some would call surgical or acupunctural. I mean, some of those terms have a lot of overlap with what we're talking about. The other part of your question was, would I work between?
How do you foresee this intersection between the two, between the market-led and the social-led practice?
Yes. Well, in almost all the work that we do, we seek to find market levers that we can deploy. As part of the city we can make, it's true, I don't have a moral stance where I think there are bad actors and good actors that I would or wouldn't work with. I think it would be hard for me to work with part of the prison industrial complex in the United States right now. I don't see any levers there. So there would be actors that I would find impossible at this moment anyway to collaborate with, but the market certainly wouldn't be one of those. I mean, we have no more public sector at some level in so many parts of the neoliberal city that if you want to reject the market, you've abandoned the entire project. So it's really a matter, in my mind, of how we work with the market to produce the kinds of urbanism that actually have a public good component to them. And that doesn't seem impossible to me, but it's easier with some actors than others. And those are the ones we should go to first in order to make demonstrable insertions into the city. Okay, that's it. This is Mikhail. Is this
Ali?
Ali.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. The catalyst approach is a complex approach because it can increase the land value of the surrounding lots. So usually when the value of the land increase, it may cause evictions and displacement. So my question is, do we need to adopt urban planning tools parallel to this approach, like land value capture, before implementing this approach? Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and kind of at the heart of a set of new concerns. It shouldn't be new. It's a historic fact that when we make these kinds of infill developments, the transformation of property values has a gentrifying effect. And now, especially in dense cities, it means that we're displacing people not to other parts of the city, but out. Because they're, at least even in Los Angeles, which is a city that was ever expanding, there is no further distance out to go. So there is no affordable land any longer. And so new strategies now have to become necessary. And one of the things we've been looking at is, are there anti-gentrifying insertions that can be made? So for instance, affordable housing tends to be anti-gentrifying. It has less of a dramatic effect on adjacent property values. So there may be, in fact, ways that we can build that also have some influence, but obviously there has to be some other kinds of complementary regulation that tries to maintain some kind of equity for those who are getting displaced. Gentrification is the most critical issue in my mind in cities that now have a housing crisis, which is most developed cities. So I don't have good answers yet, but I look forward to a series of conversations about what directions we might go.
Working? Yeah. Hi. I just want to ask your input on the first part that you did about the architecture without urbanism and urbanism without architecture. I want to take your intake on the spectacle behind all of this. So sort of like a situationist point of view, Guy Debord, you know. So if you take a resident of LA and you tell him to draw a mental map of LA, and take a resident of Barcelona and tell him to draw a mental map of Barcelona, actually what would be the correct sort of, you know, the correct sort of way to drawing the map is by the points of urbanism that you take. One of which is in the spectacle that you see in LA, you know, with all these buildings, with all these skins in front of you, in front of your face. I just want to see on an urban planner side of view on where the spectacle of these individual architecture lie within the social fabric. So when a resident sees this spectacle, for example, in contrast with seeing only the urban plan, like the resident of Barcelona, where would the urban planner put his spectacle input in?
Well, that's interesting. Of course, that goes back to 1960 and Kevin Lynch with cognitive maps. Like, what is our imaginary about cities? And you know, it's that field condition that was really the map, but that Lynch didn't even identify, right? I mean, if in Los Angeles, it's the field condition that's the city, which is where all the freeways and landmarks sit, but we don't have a map of that, meaning maybe in your terms, there's no image or spectacle there. I don't think planning by nature has a strong media presence. I don't know if you remember, there was one of the famous Brad Pitt movies where he's a spy and his wife's a spy, and when he goes to the cocktail party, he says what he is an urban planner, and then everybody's so bored they never ask him another thing about it. And I think that's kind of telling that they picked planner for that, because we're workers, you know, planners they're laborers in the field, kind of, we're working at things, but there isn't really a spectacle that we can assign to it without going back to, say, the old utopianists whose work really was remarkably spectacular but rarely built. So again, I would say that's why we should be working at the seams, at the intersections between architecture and urbanism, because like in Los Angeles, all that architecture is more spectacle than urbane, and it needs, you know, an urban dose of reality. But the planning can't get the sort of media traction without an architectural manifestation. So to me, the little backyard home is a perfect response to what you're talking about, which is, that little house was published in like the Fiji Times. Why? I have no idea. But it got published in like 14 different countries because it was kind of magical. And it's that kind of magical opening of the imagination that we need to bring to urban thinking so that we actually inspire people toward making urban plans. I don't think we can do that in our kind of abstract urban representations.
Thanks.
Even when you see something like Masdar, or one of the massive plans, like some of the Asian cities, they're not very inspiring because it's always what James Scott would call seeing like a state. You're always flying over at 10,000 feet, so it's hard to understand their real implications. That's a long answer to it. Yeah, people are afraid to ask another one.
Was your backyard home project intended for low-income communities or throughout LA?
It's throughout Los Angeles. So it came from, it was being built already in low-income communities. So low-income people added housing illegally to their backyards to generate income. And now we're hoping, the size of them is also kept quite small.
So there is no role for architects in this?
Yes. Oh, yes. So what I imagine is this is where all young architects will start now, because they're tiny little projects that we would believe young graduates could build. You don't have to have an architect to build them, but many people are using architects now. I think in the first 3 months of this year, there were something like 1,000 building permits issued, and the entire year before that there were 200. So it's really expanding, and many architects are now getting involved. But there are no it's market rate housing, rental housing, but now new programs are coming into play. So the city is offering homeowners a subsidy of something like $50,000 if you rent to a homeless person for the first 2 years. So people can get money to build it if they rent to someone who's part of the homeless population, and after 2 years, they probably may, find a new tenant, but at least for 2 years we have one homeless person.
If you can get him out.
Yes, well, that's true. That will be an interesting new problem. Maybe they'll get away. Yes.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's great work. I'm having second thoughts with how you position architectural urbanism in opposition of large-scale planning. One is a solution, and the other is the kind of failure that started with modernism. Right? If we look at urbanism in a global perspective, and I pulled some fun numbers.
It's cheating, isn't it?
For the projection for 2050, global urbanites growth, from India, China, and Nigeria, we're looking at 908 million new urbanites, right? So on a global level, we have to add about 552 Manhattans, okay? In your backyard in California, population projection for 2050 is 50 million people. So you have to add another 10 million people, 10 million urbanites to the state. So adding the equivalent of another 7 Manhattans, let's say, right? So, and these are very urgent matters. So I almost feel like we almost have to embrace any tools that we have in our means to start to address these things. So, as much as I love your presentation, there's something about your argument that I think I don't follow, and that is that the sort of architectural urbanism is the solution or is a way to approach urban growth, yet large-scale regional thinking and planning has been proven to be a failure.
Meaning, look, why would we give up on large-scale planning? We need every form of development we can imagine that could be accepted into the social and political climate. Yes, at a fundamental and theoretical level, I absolutely agree with you. So, in the story of large-scale planning in the United States, for instance, that same logic led to what we called the public housing program of the 30s and 40s. That was a huge set of large-scale interventions. We built 4,000 units at a time in different parts of the cities. In total, we built 1 million units there. Now, Sweden built the same amount in like a 7-year period, but in the United States, across the entire United States, with a massive large-scale development program, we built 1 million units. That's only 200,000 more than our backyards in California, if you want to think of it that way. And we caused a political backlash that stopped all housing production. So there aren't simple, I agree, like, we should make it big, we should make it small, we should, make it in the country, we should make it in the city. There is now in California, at least, and I think across the United States, and I'm hoping it's happening in other cities as well, what literally is called the Yes in My Backyard movement, meaning build anything, anywhere. And the last policy that I was working on at the state level, because now I have a kind of channel, was to put a height minimum. So this is a totally new idea. Instead of a maximum height or a building envelope, we put a height minimum wherever 2 bus lines cross. I mean, that's practically all of Los Angeles, even in a city with no transit. And that height minimum was, we started at something like 30 meters, which would be 22 meters over anything nearby. We dropped it, yes, it was radical. And this goes really down your line of thinking, which is, all right, if there's an opening, if there's low-hanging fruit now, which is a legislature that's willing to deal with the housing crisis, let's push it as far as we can go. And in negotiating all of that, we were very nervous that we would lose the entire political will, and we did. I just read it yesterday. They've rejected the whole bill, even though we were coming down in height. So I don't know quite where the sweet spot will be to find as much new development. But I do think that, I guess I would take the position that large-scale modernist planning is not the answer even to a massive crisis like we're finding now. That basically, that comes as much from development economics as it comes from housing production, and we need to reinvent the economic and bureaucratic model so that that's not our only resort. Yeah. I think the world just agreed with me, or disagreed with me, I'm not sure. Might have been disagreed.
Hussam Alwer from Dundee University. Thank you very much, I really enjoy it. I do have 2 or 3 a reflection from what you said, but also a follow from what my colleague. I'm so delighted with your criticism for the practice of master plan and master planning, from being very rigid, from being just about zoning and collections. And you use an interesting phrase, which is the contingency master plan. Basically, it takes time for a master plan to be realized. I know quite well in London, some master plans start 1995 and it hasn't finished. City of Freiburg in Germany, it's one of the most sustainable city now in Europe. It has started 1990 and it hasn't finished yet. So I do like your approach, incremental approach, that's the way forward. You have to accommodate it with time, understanding what you can fix at the beginning, and you have to make room for what they call it tolerance, change. How do you accommodate change? If I may say, using my Arabic hat, because I am originally from Syria, I think that's what we need. You can't fix a master plan. And unfortunately, we have now two extreme. One extreme, which I like, I am in favor of what you call incremental approach, or there is another book I came to know from a very interesting practitioner in the UK. He called it massive small. Massive small, which is about incremental approach. On the other hand, you have this extreme in China, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, where the master plan must build up within 6 months without understanding the intangible and tangible benefit. Now, part of this problem, if I may say, and I really don't want to be negative, but through my visit to most of Arab countries, part of our issues, and that's, by the way, even including in the UK, people, especially private sector, they see the master plan just as two things: collection of buildings sometimes, or they use it as what they call it land use. It is a land use, and it is just to do with how to maximize the profit and benefit. And you will be very lucky if you have a private sector person where he how can I say, has a vision for more than 5 years. Very lucky, by the way. Why? Because they want the quick in and the quick out within 2 to 3 years. Thank you.
No, but I would just say I'd like to distinguish what I was talking about from incrementalism, which is a kind of thinking that I think we've known about. And so incrementalism means doing a little bit now and a little bit later and a little bit after that, or small scale interventions. Whereas I'm really trying to define a kind of increment that maybe is the same as massive small, or large change, small intervention. There's a number of different schools of thought, but it's a kind of increment that I think isn't an isolated development. So I didn't mention that, but that's an important distinction to make. I'm not an advocate of incrementalism, but.
My question is, you found this radical increment to work with, and I think it's wonderful that for people to think about what to do with this with the situation. Do you have any projects at City Lab that deal with actually density, like in Beirut, as opposed like in LA? You found this little getaway where you can have these extra long lots, so that was great that you noticed that. Do you have any projects at City Lab where we have no space whatsoever?
How do we deal with real density?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good question. We're actually now working on the next scale of infill, which isn't as dense as probably you deal with here, but any vacant site now is considered a possible site for infill. And maybe in the neighborhoods where you see the centers of the blocks here being occupied by different uses, whether it's restaurants or other kinds of structures, it's that kind of infill. So like the New York scheme, where the housing sites were now seen as sites for new housing sites, we are working with the school district to take every schoolyard and to add density right on top of that, and to make that into a kind of new kind of mixed use. 8 kids playing baseball on 2 different fields isn't necessary at most schools. So not only can we take the field, but all the space that's in the campus and build above it. And there are a series of projects like that now that we're trying to use as a kind of sectional city, what you might call the sectional city, whether it's structured parking and building housing on top of that. I mean, my sort of, another question you could ask me is like, do you ever do anything but housing? That I don't do, but I'm trying to find higher densities than backyards to implement new housing, and that probably goes to the question that was over here as well. Yeah.
Any new questions?
These questions are so interesting.
I'm just curious, since this project was inspired by these illegal structures that were existing, when the law was created, were the illegal structures, was amnesty given to the existing, to those structures?
It turns out that's a much more complicated project than we're working on that, but that's taking a whole new kind of collaboration, because for the most part, many of them could be legally approved now, but others were built without any kind of inspection, and so it's not so clear they're safe. And we've just totally resisted even touching upon them because it will mean that we displace their occupants. So there's the estimates of how many of those illegal units is really unclear. There might be as many as 50,000, and that's a lot of housing. And at the moment, we haven't found a way to legalize the illegal units. And it's a critical issue, mainly around safety and inspections. So it's best at the moment not to even pay attention to them, because if we do, it will cause them to be deemed illegal. And then they'll have to be, not only will the residents get displaced, but the households that depend on that rental income will lose their income. So.
Shall we end this session?
Thank you so much for such interesting questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we hope we will see you tomorrow morning for the social agenda. We'll start then we'll continue all through the day. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything.